The sun hangs like a merciless copper coin against an endless blue canvas, its heat distorting the air above the cracked earth. Saguaro cacti stand sentinel over a landscape that has forgotten the meaning of mercy. The silence is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through thorned mesquite and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above. Through this desolation rides Jacob McAllister, 52 years old, his weathered face a map of hard-won experience. His horse, a sturdy bay named Roosevelt, picks its way carefully between scattered stones and withered creosote bushes. Jacob's clothes speak of long miles and longer nights. Leather chaps worn smooth, a faded blue shirt stained with honest sweat, and a hat that has seen more storms than most men see years. He pauses, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow with a red bandana that has faded to the color of old rust. His eyes, pale blue like winter sky, scan the horizon with the practiced gaze of a man who has learned to read danger in the silence between heartbeats. 27 years ago, he was a different man. 27 years ago, he wore the uniform of the United States Cavalry and carried orders to push the Apache deeper into the wilderness. Now he carries only guilt and a water canteen that sloshes half-empty against his hip. Roosevelt snorts and tosses his head, ears pricked forward. Jacob follows the horse's gaze to an outcropping of red stone rising from the desert floor like the broken backbone of some ancient creature. Heat waves dance above the rocks, but something else moves there. A flash of color that doesn't belong to the landscape's muted palette. "Easy, boy," Jacob murmurs, his voice rough from hours of silence. He nudges the horse forward, one hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt, .45, though he hopes he won't need it. Hope, in this country, is often a luxury a man can't afford, but Jacob has learned to carry it anyway. As they draw closer to the rocks, the source of movement becomes clear. A woman sits in the meager shade of an overhanging ledge, her long black hair catching the filtered sunlight like strands of obsidian. She wears traditional Apache dress, a doeskin blouse decorated with turquoise beads and a flowing skirt dyed the deep red of desert clay. But it's her posture that tells the real story. The careful way she holds her left shoulder, the slight tremble in her hands, the careful stillness of someone conserving strength they can barely afford to spend. Jacob reins in Roosevelt 20 feet away, close enough to speak, far enough to respect the unspoken rules of the desert. Out here, trust is earned drop by drop, like water from stone. "Ma'am," he says, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. His voice carries the weight of authority earned rather than bestowed, but beneath it runs a current of genuine concern. The woman looks up, and Jacob finds himself staring into eyes the color of cedar smoke. There's pain there, and wariness, but also a dignity that suffering hasn't been able to touch. She studies him with the careful attention of a tracker reading sign, taking in his weathered face, his worn but clean clothes, the way his horse stands calm and patient beneath him. "Water," she says in English, the word shaped by an accent that makes it sound like a prayer. "Please." Jacob doesn't hesitate. He swings down from Roosevelt's back, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seems to echo in the stillness. The woman tenses as he approaches, ready to flee despite her obvious weakness, but something in his unhurried movements seems to reassure her. He unslings his canteen and holds it out, waiting for her to accept it rather than forcing the gesture. When she reaches for it, he notices the dark stain on her doeskin blouse, the way her breathing comes shallow and quick. "You're hurt," he observes, settling onto his heels a respectful distance away. She drinks deeply, water running down her chin and darkening the red dust at her feet. When she finally lowers the canteen, she wipes her mouth with the back of her hand and meets his gaze directly. "Bullet," she says simply, gesturing to her shoulder. "2 days ago. Soldiers." Jacob's jaw tightens. He has no love for the blue-coated men who still patrol this territory with orders to kill first and ask questions of the dead. In his cavalry days, He'd seen too much of what passed for justice when it came at the end of a rifle barrel. "My name's Jacob McAllister," he says, offering his name like an olive branch. "And I'd be pleased to help you, if you'll let me." The woman, who gives her name as Ayanna, which she tells him means eternal blossom, allows Jacob to examine her wound. The bullet has passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder, missing bone, but leaving a ragged tear that shows signs of infection. Jacob works with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wound with precious water from his canteen and binding it with strips torn from his spare shirt. "The soldiers," Ayanna says as he works, her voice steady despite the pain, "they came to our winter camp. Said we were too close to the settlement at Esperanza Creek. Said we had 3 days to move." Jacob's hands pause in their work. He knows Esperanza Creek, knows the kind of men who've settled there. Gold seekers and cattle ranchers mostly, the sort who see Apache presence as an obstacle to their ambitions rather than a fact of the land's long history. "Did you move?" he asks, though he suspects he knows the answer. Ayanna's smile is bitter as desert sage. "Where were we to go? The reservation is full of Chiricahua who hate us, and the Mexican border is watched by soldiers on both sides. The desert is all we have left, and now they want to take even that." Jacob finishes binding the wound and sits back on his heels. Around them, the desert continues its ancient rhythm, the rustle of lizards in the brush, the distant call of a coyote testing its voice against the coming evening. But beneath that natural music, he hears something else. The sound of hoofbeats, still faint but growing stronger. "Company coming," he says, rising to peer over the rocks. In the distance, a dust cloud marks the approach of riders. Too many riders, moving too fast for friendly intentions. Ayanna struggles to her feet, swaying with the effort. "My people," she says, and there's something in her voice, hope mixed with fear, like a prayer offered without much faith in the answer. The riders emerge from their own dust cloud like figures from a fever dream. Apache warriors, 40 or 50 strong, their horses painted for war and their faces set in expressions that could cut glass. They spread out as they approach, forming a loose semicircle that Jacob recognizes as a classic tactical formation. These men have been shaped by the same hard country that made him, and they wear their readiness for violence like other men wear their Sunday clothes. At their head rides a man who can only be a war chief. He's perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and scars that tell the story of a life lived on the edge of survival. His name, Jacob will learn later, is Cocheta, and he has been hunting the soldiers who shot his daughter for 3 days without rest. The warriors rein in their horses 20 yards away, and the silence that follows has the weight of judgment hanging over it. Jacob stands perfectly still, his hands visible and empty, though he's acutely aware of the rifle strapped to Roosevelt's saddle and the Colt at his hip. Numbers like this, though, such weapons would be about as useful as throwing pebbles at a thunderstorm. Cocheta dismounts and walks forward, his movement carrying the fluid grace of a man equally comfortable on horseback or on foot. His eyes move from Jacob to Ayanna and back again, reading the scene with practiced attention to detail. "My daughter," he says in English, his accent heavy, but his meaning clear. "What have you done to her?" "Helped her," Jacob replies simply. "Fed her water, tended her wound." Cocheta's gaze flicks to the bandage around Ayanna's shoulder, noting the clean white cloth and the absence of fresh blood. His daughter speaks rapidly in Apache, her words flowing like water over stone, and Jacob watches the war chief's expression shift from suspicion to something more complex. "She says you shared your water freely," Cocheta says after she finishes. "She says you asked for nothing in return." "Man sees another person suffering in the desert, he helps if he can," Jacob says. "Seems like basic human decency to me." One of the younger warriors, his face painted with red and black stripes, nudges his horse forward and speaks urgently to Cocheta in Apache. Jacob doesn't understand the words, but the tone is clear enough. This warrior sees him as an enemy to be dealt with accordingly. Cocheta raises a hand, and the young man falls silent. The war chief's attention returns to Jacob, studying him with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle that could mean the difference between life and death. "You are the one they call Ghost Walker," Cocheta says, and it's not a question. Jacob feels a chill that has nothing to do with the desert evening. That name belongs to another life, another man who wore cavalry blue and carried out orders he now wishes he could forget. He hasn't heard it spoken aloud in 15 years. "I was," he admits. "Long time ago. You killed many of our people." "I did." Jacob meets the war chief's gaze without flinching, and I've regretted it every day since. The warriors shift restlessly in their saddles. Hands drift toward weapons, and Jacob can feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and this encounter will end in blood. But Cocheta raises his hand again, and the moment holds. "My daughter also tells me something else," he says. "She says when the soldiers shot her, she heard one of them speak your name. She says they hunt you as well." Jacob nods slowly. "I've been riding hard for 3 days. They want me to answer for some things I did back in Esperanza Creek. Things that needed doing, but the law doesn't see it that way." "What things?" "The settlement's been taking Apache children," Jacob says, his voice carrying the weight of hard truth. "Selling them to families in California who want servants more than children. I put a stop to it." The silence that follows is different now, not hostile, but thoughtful. Cocheta exchanges glances with several of his warriors, and Jacob catches fragments of rapid conversation in Apache. He doesn't understand the words, but he recognizes the tone of men debating choices that will shape their futures. As the sun begins its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Cocheta makes his decision. He walks closer to Jacob, close enough that their conversation can't be overheard by the other warriors. "Ghost Walker," he says, "you have done a great kindness to my daughter, and perhaps a greater kindness to our people by protecting our children. But the soldiers who come, they are the same ones who shot Ayana, who burned our winter camp and killed 7 of our people." "How many soldiers?" Jacob asks. 30, maybe 35, led by the one with the yellow hair and the scar across his cheek. Jacob knows that description. Captain William Thorne, a man who's made his reputation fighting Apache and takes entirely too much pleasure in the work. If Thorne is leading the pursuit, then this isn't just about justice. It's about revenge. "They'll be here by morning," Cocheta continues, "and they will not distinguish between you and us. In their eyes, we are all enemies to be eliminated. So what do you propose?" Cocheta is quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across his warriors to his daughter and back to Jacob. When he speaks again, his words carry the weight of tradition and the urgency of survival. "Among my people, there is an old law. When a man saves the life of a chief's daughter and asks nothing in return, when he shares his water freely in the desert, he may be chosen to stand with us as a brother." Jacob feels the significance of the moment like a physical weight. Around them, the warriors have fallen silent, sensing that something momentous is taking shape. "I don't understand," Jacob says. "At dawn, when the sun rises, my warriors will decide. If they choose you, you will fight beside us against the soldiers. If they do not." Cocheta spreads his hands. "Then you will face Captain Thorne alone, and we will take our wounded and disappear into the deep desert. And if they choose me? Then you become Apache, not by blood, but by choice. You become one of us, with all that means." Jacob looks around at the faces watching him, some curious, some suspicious, some openly hostile. These are hard men, shaped by years of fighting for their survival against overwhelming odds. They've seen their people driven from their ancestral lands, their children stolen, their way of life slowly strangled by the advancing tide of settlement and government policy. "I need to think about this," he says. Cochetta nods. "The night is long. Think well, Ghost Walker. By dawn, you must choose. Stand with us, or stand alone." The Apache make camp in a shallow valley sheltered by towering saguaro cacti and ocotillo bushes. They move with practiced efficiency, posting guards and tending to their horses with the quiet competence of people who've learned that survival depends on attention to detail. Jacob sits apart from the main group, Roosevelt hobbled nearby, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Ayanna approaches him, walking slowly but steadily. The treatment of her wound has helped, but he can see she's still in considerable pain. "May I sit?" she asks. Jacob nods, and she settles beside him on a flat rock, careful not to jar her injured shoulder. "You saved my life today," she says simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "No." Her voice is firm. "Not anyone. Most of your people see us as animals, things to be removed or destroyed. You saw a person in need." They sit in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush, the soft murmur of conversation from the Apache camp. "Tell me about the children," Ayanna says finally. Jacob sighs, the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. "There's a man in Esperanza Creek named Morrison, runs the general store, has connections in California. He's been working with some of the soldiers, including Captain Thorne. They'd attack Apache camps, claim they were defending settlers, but they'd make sure to capture any children they could and sell them." Daunt Morrison had buyers lined up, families who wanted domestic help and didn't ask too many questions about where it came from. The children would disappear into California, and by the time anyone realized what was happening, they'd be scattered across the state with new names and no way to get home. Ayanna's hands clench into fists. "How many?" "I don't know. Dozen, maybe more. I only found out about it by accident. Caught Morrison negotiating with one of his buyers behind the store. When I confronted him, he tried to buy me off, then threatened to have me killed." "So you killed him first?" Jacob nods grimly. "Him and two of the soldiers who were guarding the children. Freed 8 kids and got them back to their families, but by then word had reached Captain Thorne. He's been hunting me ever since. And now you must choose. Die alone for doing what was right, or live as one of us. It's not that simple." Ayanna turns to face him, her dark eyes reflecting starlight. "Why not? You have no family in the white world, no place that calls you home. I can see it in the way you sit your horse, the way you watch the horizon. You are already a man between worlds." Jacob considers this, recognizing the truth in her words. Since leaving the cavalry 15 years ago, he's drifted from job to job, place to place, never quite finding anywhere he belongs. He's been a trail guide, a ranch hand, a town marshal, a dozen other things, but never really settled. "Your people have reason to hate me," he says. "I was part of what drove them from their lands." "Yes," Ayanna agrees, "but you were also part of what saved our children. My father is a wise man, Ghostwalker. He sees that the old ways of fighting will only lead to our destruction. Perhaps what we need is not more warriors, but warriors who understand both worlds." The sun rises slowly over the desert, painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. Jacob stands beside Roosevelt, checking his gear one final time. In the distance, a dust cloud marks the approach of Captain Thorne's soldiers, still an hour away, maybe less. Cochetta emerges from his shelter, followed by his warriors. They form a rough circle around Jacob, their faces grave with the weight of decision. The night has been long, filled with heated discussion in rapid Apache that Jacob couldn't understand, but whose passion was unmistakable. "Ghost Walker," Cochetta says, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "My warriors have debated through the night. Some see only the uniform you once wore, and the blood you once spilled. Others see the man who shared his water with a wounded woman and asked nothing in return. Jacob waits, feeling the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon him. But there is another thing they see, Cochetta continues. They see a man who risked everything to save our children, who chose righteousness over safety, who stands ready to face his enemies alone rather than bring harm to others. The war chief pauses, his gaze moving across his assembled warriors. The vote was close, he admits, but it was clear. You are chosen, Ghostwalker. If you will have us, we will have you. A murmur runs through the gathered warriors, some pleased, some clearly still uncertain, but all accepting of their chief's pronouncement. Jacob feels something shift inside him, a sense of belonging he hasn't experienced in longer than he can remember. I accept, he says simply. Cochetta nods and produces a necklace from beneath his shirt, a simple strand of turquoise beads with a small silver medallion. This belonged to my brother, who died fighting the Mexican army 20 years ago. Wear it and know that you are no longer alone in this world. Jacob accepts the necklace and places it around his neck. The medallion feels warm against his chest, as if it carries some essential heat of the man who wore it before. Now, Cochetta says, his tone shifting to that of a war chief preparing for battle. We have work to do. 30 soldiers approach from the east, and they come with blood in their hearts. How shall we greet them? Jacob considers the tactical situation. The valley provides good defensive positions among the rocks and cacti, but it's also a potential trap if they're surrounded. Captain Thorn is a competent officer, despite his personal failings, and his soldiers are experienced Indian fighters. We don't have to kill them all, Jacob says slowly. What we need is to break their will to fight, make them understand that continuing this pursuit will cost more than they're willing to pay. You have a plan. Jacob points to a narrow pass at the valley's eastern end, the most likely route for the soldiers to take in their approach. If we can control that pass, we control the battle. Force them to come at us where we're strongest, make them pay for every yard. Cochetta smiles, and for the first time Jacob sees approval in the war chief's eyes. You think like Apache now, brother. Not seeking glorious death, but seeking victory. Desert Pass, day. The soldiers arrive in formation, Captain Thorn riding at their head with the confidence of a man accustomed to easy victories over outnumbered opponents. He's a tall, lean man with sun-bleached hair and a scar that runs from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from an Apache lance 3 years earlier. The pass ahead looks empty, showing nothing but sun-baked stone and scattered desert vegetation. Thorn raises his hand, bringing the column to a halt, and studies the terrain with professional attention. Sergeant Bradley, he calls to a grizzled non-com riding beside him. What do you think? Bradley spits a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and squints at the rocks ahead. Looks quiet, sir. But this is the kind of country where quiet don't mean safe. My thoughts exactly. Thorn removes his campaign hat and wipes sweat from his forehead. Send scouts ahead. I want to know what's waiting for us in there. But before the scouts can move, a voice echoes from the rocks above. That's far enough, Captain. Thorn's head snaps up, his hand moving automatically to his sidearm. Jacob emerges from concealment on a ledge 30 feet above the pass, clearly visible but well protected behind a wall of stone. Jacob McAllister, Thorn says, his scarred face twisting into something that might charitably be called a smile. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Have you now? Jacob's voice carries easily in the clear desert air. Well, here I am. What is it you wanted to discuss? Murder, for starters. Grand theft. Interfering with military operations. That what you're calling child slavery now? Military operations? Thorn's face darkens. Those children were legitimate prisoners of war, taken in accordance with military necessity. 8-year-old prisoners of war. Jacob's voice carries a note of disgust. You should be ashamed to wear that uniform, Captain. The uniform I wear represents the authority of the United States government, which you have chosen to defy. Surrender now, and I guarantee you'll live to see trial." Jacob laughs, but there's no humor in it. "Your guarantees aren't worth much, Captain. Besides, I'm not alone up here." As if summoned by his words, Apache warriors begin appearing on the rocks around the pass. Not all of them, Jacob notes with professional approval, but enough to make their presence felt. Cochetta has positioned his men well, holding some in reserve while showing enough strength to give the soldiers pause. Thorn's confident expression wavers as he takes in the tactical situation. His men shift uneasily in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons but not quite drawing them. The pass has become a potential killing ground, with Apache fighters holding the high ground on three sides. "So," Thorn says, raising his voice to address the rocks around him, "the great Ghost Walker has turned Apache. I suppose that makes sense. A traitor finding his way to other traitors." "Careful, Captain," Jacob warns. "These men have lost friends and family to your raids. They're not in a mood for insults." What are they in a mood for? Negotiation? Before Jacob can respond, Cochetta emerges from concealment on the opposite side of the pass. He moves with casual confidence, his rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. "We are in a mood for justice," the war chief says, his English carrying only the slightest trace of accent. "You burned our camp. You shot my daughter. You killed 7 of our people, including 2 children. Hostile action against lawful military operations," Thorn responds, but his voice lacks conviction. "The children you killed were playing by the stream," Cochetta continues, his tone matter-of-fact. "The youngest was 4 years old. What military threat did she pose, Captain?" Sergeant Bradley leans close to Thorn and speaks in an urgent whisper. Jacob can't hear the words, but he can guess their content. The sergeant is a veteran who recognizes a bad tactical situation when he sees one. "What do you want?" Thorn asks finally. "We want you to turn around," Jacob says. "Take your soldiers and go back to Esperanza Creek. Tell your superiors that Jacob McAllister died in the desert, killed by Apache raiders. End this pursuit. And in return? You get to live," Cochetta says simply. "You get to see your families again. You get to fight another day, when the odds are more in your favor." Thorn considers this, his scarred face working through the calculations. 30 soldiers against an unknown number of Apache fighters in defensive positions. Even if he wins, the cost will be heavy. "And if I refuse, then we fight," Jacob says. "And some of us will die, probably many of us. But you'll die too, Captain, and most of your men with you. Is that worth it? Is catching 1 man worth that price?" The standoff stretches for what feels like hours but is probably no more than 30 minutes. Sweat drips from the soldiers' faces as they sit their horses in the brutal desert sun, acutely aware of the rifles trained on them from the rocks above. Thorn confers quietly with his sergeants, while the Apache warriors wait with the patient stillness of men who have learned that time often solves problems that bullets only complicate. Finally, Thorn makes his decision. He raises his hand in a gesture that's part signal, part surrender. "Sergeant Bradley," he calls, never taking his eyes off Jacob. "The men will dismount and water their horses. We'll rest here for an hour, then return to Esperanza Creek." Relief flows through the pass like a cool breeze. Soldiers slide from their saddles with evident gratitude, and the Apache warriors begin emerging from their positions among the rocks. The immediate crisis has passed, but Jacob knows better than to assume the danger is over. He climbs down from his perch and approaches Thorn, aware that every eye in the pass is watching this encounter. The captain has dismounted as well, and stands beside his horse with the careful posture of a man trying to maintain dignity in defeat. "You're making the right choice," Jacob says quietly. "Am I?" Thorn's scarred face is unreadable. Or am I just postponing the inevitable? Maybe both, but sometimes postponing is enough. Thorn looks around at the Apache warriors, noting their discipline and the quality of their weapons. These aren't the desperate, starving bands his reports have described, but well-organized fighters with strong leadership. "They're not what I expected," he admits. "What did you expect?" "Savages. Bloodthirsty animals." Jacob follows his gaze to where Cocheta is organizing his men, ensuring that the wounded Ayana has water and shade, checking on the younger warriors with the careful attention of a leader who values every life under his command. "They're just people, Captain. People who've been pushed to the edge and are fighting to survive. People who've killed American soldiers. People who've had their children stolen and sold like livestock." Jacob's voice hardens. People who've watched their way of life destroyed by men who see them as obstacles to progress. Thorne is quiet for a moment, studying Jacob with something that might be curiosity. "What happened to you, McAllister? You were a good soldier once. I read your service record. 3 commendations, promoted twice in the field. What changed?" Jacob considers the question, watching as Apache and American soldiers share the meager shade of the pass with careful, mutual respect. "I learned to see past the uniform," he says finally. "Learned that the world isn't divided into good people and bad people, but into people trying to do right and people trying to do wrong. And which am I? That's for you to decide, Captain. But I'll tell you this, a man who walks away from a fight that doesn't need to happen, who chooses his soldiers' lives over his own pride, that man has the potential to be better than his worst orders." As evening approaches, Captain Thorne keeps his word. The soldiers mount up and ride east, their dust cloud gradually fading into the distance. Jacob stands with Cocheta and Ayana on a rise overlooking the valley, watching their former enemies disappear into the vastness of the desert. "Do you think they'll stay gone?" Ayana asks. "For now," Jacob says. "Thorne will report that he couldn't find me, that the Apache disappeared into the deep desert. That'll buy us time, maybe a lot of time." "And what will we do with that time?" Cocheta asks. It's a profound question, one that gets to the heart of the choice Jacob has made. He's no longer the cavalry officer who followed orders without question, but neither is he simply a drifter without purpose. He's become something new, a bridge between worlds, a man who might help find a path forward that doesn't end in mutual destruction. "We survive," he says finally. "We protect our people, all our people. We look for ways to live that don't require anyone to die." Cocheta nods slowly. "You speak wisdom, brother, but the world is not always interested in wisdom." "No," Jacob agrees, "but that doesn't mean we stop trying." As they walk back toward the Apache camp, where cook fires are beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars, Jacob feels the weight of the turquoise necklace against his chest. It's a tangible reminder of the choice he's made, the community he's joined, the responsibility he's accepted. The desert spreads around them in all directions, vast and seemingly empty, but full of hidden life for those who know how to look for it. Somewhere out there, Captain Thorne is riding back to Esperanza Creek with a story that will satisfy his superiors for now. Somewhere out there, Apache children are growing up free because of choices made and risks taken. And here, in this hidden valley, 2 peoples who've been enemies are learning to see each other as human beings, with hopes and fears and dreams worth protecting. It's not a perfect solution. Jacob knows. The larger forces of history are still in motion. The railroad is coming, more settlers will follow, and the old ways of life will continue to face pressure from the new. But today, in this place, with these people, something different has happened. Today, understanding has triumphed over hatred, cooperation over conflict. As the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, Jacob McAllister, former cavalry officer, former drifter, newly chosen Apache warrior, settles by the fire with his new family. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own opportunities to do right or wrong. But tonight, there is peace in the desert, and that's enough.